So I want to begin by thanking Brinjar Leah and the Center for Islamic Middle Eastern Studies for inviting me to beautiful, cold, rainy Norway to speak with all of you today and to thank all of you for coming. And I want to also give a special thanks to Heidi Breen Ralken, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who took charge of all the arrangements for my trip. So thank you. On June 30th, 2012, Mohammed Morsi, a leader in the Muslim Brotherhood, was sworn in as Egypt's first democratically elected president. For those of us who've been following events in the region for decades, this event felt surreal. A technically illegal organization that had spent most of its existence subject to the depredations of a hostile authoritarian state was now, it seemed, in charge of the very institutions once used to repress it. Yet looking back, we know that things were not as different as they first appeared, as Morsi would be repeatedly challenged and ultimately ousted by officials of the deep state carried over from the Mubarak era. The Brotherhood's twists of fate have made headlines around the globe, but their broader implications are open to debate. Indeed, it's far from clear which situation poses a greater threat to Egypt's democratic prospects, the Brotherhood's domination of the political system, or its exclusion from it. This reflects the fact that the worldviews, goals, and strategies of Islamist actors, as well as the internal operations of the movement organizations of which they are a part, remain poorly understood. While this is true for all Islamist groups, such knowledge gaps are particularly acute with respect to Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. In the years before the Arab Spring, mainstream Islamist groups in Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait, and elsewhere in the region established legal, above-board political blocs and parties and participated relatively freely in electoral politics, and in the process became more transparent and accessible to public scrutiny. During the same time frame, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt remained deprived of legal status, prohibited from forming its own party, and at chronic risk of repression. For such reasons, it's understandable that Brotherhood leaders preferred to operate in the shadows and were reluctant to share information about their membership, financing, and activities with outsiders. Back in the year 2000, I interviewed Ismail Aryan, a leader in the Brotherhood who was reportedly in charge of the group's campaign in the parliamentary elections that fall, in which Brotherhood candidates were running its independence. Aryan had just been released from prison after serving 5 years for, quote, helping to revive an illegal organization opposed to the public order, unquote. At the start of our interview, by way of introduction, I asked Aryan to identify his position in the Brotherhood. At that point, he turned to a colleague sitting next to him and muttered, I answered that question and I get another 5 years with hard labor. I mention this anecdote to highlight the fact that even such basic issues as the leadership structure of the Brotherhood and the individuals who occupy key posts within it were hard to pin down when I began the research for my book. This is a point, I think, of wider relevance to mainstream political science, where description, getting the facts straight, is often discounted as a form of glorified journalism. Yet many of the questions of key interest in the field of comparative politics cannot be addressed unless and until important gaps in our knowledge have been filled. With this in mind, the first objective of my new book is a descriptive one. In particular, it explores what goes on within the black box of Islamic movements, including the processes they use to select leaders and deliberate on important policy decisions. In addition, it highlights the issues of ideology and strategy that have become pivots of internal debate, the methods senior leaders have used to inculcate group unity and discipline, the conditions under which such efforts succeed or fail, and finally, when and why internal tensions lead to organizational splits. My ability to gather information on such issues hinged on relationships of friendship and trust with Islamist leaders that took years to cultivate. In addition, it required coping with frequent setbacks and frustrations, including being asked repeatedly to prove that I was not an undercover agent for the Mossad or the CIA. And the closer I got to a particular feature of the group, the fuzzier its edges would become, and the less susceptible it was to being categorized in simple terms of black and white. In sum, the more I learned, the more aware I became that whatever glimpses I had managed to gain into the inner workings of the Brotherhood were, in an apt phrase to use in Norway, only the tip of the iceberg. And the more obvious it was that more research was needed to capture the movement dynamics of the Brotherhood and its counterparts in the Arab world in all their nuance and complexity. In sum, to put it bluntly, the more convinced I became that it was high time for political science to stop dissing description. Despite the surge in the range of statistical techniques available to scholars in recent years, the fact remains that those of us who study politics in the developing world must often generate our own data through painstaking, maddening, time-consuming fieldwork, including efforts to persuade the gatekeepers of such information to share it with a complete stranger. Under such conditions, getting the facts straight is a vital precursor to investigating the mechanisms of cause and effect of central interest to our discipline. So what causal processes are explored in my book? At the broadest level, it investigates how the participation of mainstream Islamist actors in the domain of foreign politics has affected their worldviews, goals, strategies, and behavior, as well as the institutional structures and practices of the movement organizations of which they are a part. Islamist groups entered the system in order to change it, I argue, but in the process, they ended up being changed by the system themselves. One of the most striking and conspicuous changes that occurred was a growing emphasis on democracy, pluralism, and citizenship rights in the platforms and speeches of the Brotherhood and other mainstream Islamist groups in the region. Why have Islamist groups come to embrace ideas they once rejected as products of the West and as at odds with Islam itself? And are the forces at work similar to those which prompted other types of anti-system parties and groups to accommodate themselves to the messy give and take of democratic politics in other regions and historical eras? Such questions prompted me to vet the literature on the evolution of socialist and Christian parties in Europe and Latin America, including the seminal works of Huntington, Jaworski, Sprague, and Kalivas, among others. While such studies offered valuable insights, they left much to be desired as a foundation for the study of Islamist movement change. First, while Huntington and others asserted the existence of a causal link between participation and moderation, both of these concepts and the alleged causal mechanisms between them could be understood in different ways, and hence were too abstract and imprecise to serve as an anchor for my study. Second, much of the literature on movement de-radicalization was informed by rational choice theory, causing it to privilege certain lines of inquiry over others. For example, in the work of Jaworski and Sprague, the de-radicalization of socialist parties in Western Europe is largely depicted as a function of instrumental considerations of party advantage. By contrast, little to no attention is paid to the ways participation affected socialist leaders' core values, commitments, and beliefs, other than to note in passing that they underwent a process of democratic habituation, the dynamics of which remained unexplored. One of the main findings of my book is that Islamist movement change was not a function of a single strand of cause and effect, but rather entailed multiple causal processes operating simultaneously. Progressive change in Islamist rhetoric and behavior was in part a process of strategic adaptation, but it also bears the imprint of conscious and unconscious changes in Islamist actors' underlying values, beliefs, and commitments. Drawing on the constructivist strand of international relations theory, my book considers when, how, and why the preferences of political actors change over time, issues typically bracketed by rational choice analysis. Further, it suggests that defining preferences in terms of rational self-interest is problematic, as it fails to consider instances in which political actors are motivated wholly or in part by ideological commitments up to and including the embrace of self-sacrifice for a higher cause. In sum, the main analytic contribution of my book is to demonstrate that, at least in the 4 cases under study, Islamist movement change was more than a process of strategic adaptation to changing political opportunities and constraints. That is, it also entailed changes in the values and beliefs of some Islamist actors as a function of the new life experiences they gained once they broke out of the insular networks of the Islamist movement and began to interact with other civil and political actors on a regular basis. Such value change occurred first and foremost at the level of individuals. As a result, the extent to which it assumed a collective form and achieved broader influence and traction within the Islamist groups understudied varied. Indeed, I would argue, such differences help explain why the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt forged ahead with the establishment of new institutions in the wake of the Arab Spring that lacked broad public support, in sharp contrast with the path taken by their counterparts in the Nahda party in Tunisia. Let me elaborate a little bit on each of these points in turn. To a greater degree than most studies, my book distinguishes between different levels of movement change and explores the connections between them. In particular, I look at when, how, and why progressive change occurs at the level of the individual, when and how such value change acquires a collective dimension, and when and how progressive beliefs, worldviews, and values gain broader influence and traction within Islamist movement organizations over time. First, I argue, Islamist actors vary in their sensibilities, personalities, and outlooks, as do we all, and hence do not respond to similar events and circumstances in exactly the same way. That is why participation in electoral politics and interactions with individuals and groups outside Islamist circles fueled a progressive shift in the views of some Islamic actors, but not others. Second, I argue, value change at the level of the individual can assume a collective dimension when enough people are affected by the same experiences in roughly the same ways. Indeed, we can discern the rise of a reformist trend within all of the Islamist groups included in my study following their entry into the domain of electoral politics. Though this trend was not confined to any one generational cohort, many of the figures who came to identify with the reformist trend had become active in the Islamic movement as university students in the 1970s and 1980s, and after graduating went on to represent the Brotherhood and similar groups in wider domains of public life. As they explained to me in long-form open-ended interviews, sustained interaction with political and civil society actors outside Islamist circles transformed how they viewed the world and persuaded them that the official platforms and practices of the main organizations of the Islamist movement were in need of a fundamental overhaul. Hence, they became proponents of movement self-criticism, or al-naqd evet, and self-reform, al-islah evet. In particular, they rejected the call for the application of traditional Shari'a rulings inherited from the past, and embraced new interpretations of Islam that privileged ideas of freedom, pluralism, and popular consent as the foundation of rightful authority. In addition, they rejected traditional Islamic discourse on the subordinate status of women and non-Muslims, and advocated equal rights for all citizens, though still insisting that men and women have complementary rights and obligations in the domain of the home. Finally, they called on leaders of Islamist groups to abandon their habits of self-isolation and cooperate more fully with democracy and human rights activists outside Islamist circles. As I note in my book, one can trace the emergence of a reformist trend in all four of the Islamist groups included in my study, a process with roughly the same starting point, in which roughly the same set of triggers produced roughly the same set of effects. Yet the reformist current gained more traction in some Arab Islamist groups than in others. Of the four groups included in my study, the one in which figures affiliated with the reformist trend gained the most influence over the group's policy agenda was in the Parti de Justice et de Développement, or PJD, in Morocco, and the one in which they gained the least traction and influence at the senior levels of the leadership was in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. If we include a Ennahda party in Tunisia, a case not included in my book, the contrast with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood becomes even more obvious. In Tunisia, Rashid al-Ghannouchi and other figures associated with the reformist wing of the Ennahda party have shaped the party's agenda since President Ben Ali's departure. By contrast, it was not the reformists, but the more insular and ideologically rigid Dawa faction, together with an intermediary faction I refer to as the pragmatic conservatives, who called the shots in the Egyptian Brotherhood after Mubarak resigned. Indeed, in sharp contrast with the situation in Morocco and Tunisia, in the years leading up to the Arab Spring, the reformist trend had become increasingly marginalized within the Brotherhood, and many of its most dynamic leaders had left the group to pursue new initiatives of their own. While figures associated with the reformist wing of the Islamist movement in Egypt were embraced by secular democracy activists and researchers at home and abroad, including myself, they never managed to break the monopoly on power held by the old guard, a clique of veteran leaders in their 70s and 80s who survived the repression of the Nasser era, resumed their outreach activities under Sadat, and remained largely encapsulated within the movement's insular networks in the years that followed. Indeed, at the broadest level, the trajectory of the Muslim Brotherhood up to the outbreak of the Arab Spring is essentially a story of the staying power of the old guard in the face of external and internal challenges. Among the major achievements of the old guard was its success in cultivating the loyalty of leaders in subsequent age cohorts, including those like Mohammed Morsi, who gained new political competencies and skills representing the Brotherhood in Parliament. One of the key mechanisms enabling the old guard to entrench themselves in power was their control over appointments at the local branch offices and over the recruitment and socialization of new recruits. Indeed, during the Mubarak years, while reformist leaders were managing the affairs of some of Egypt's largest professional syndicates, holding conferences and workshops in democracy and human rights, and building relationships with secular opposition activists, the conservatives were quietly building a loyal membership base within Brotherhood branch offices around the country. As Abu al-Mahdi, a reformist figure who left the Brotherhood to form the Wasat or Center Party in 1996, recalled, he and like-minded Brotherhood activists who directed their energies to organizing high-profile events in Cairo and traveling to attend conferences in other Arab states and in Europe, were reluctant to take time out of their busy schedules to trek out to dusty branch offices in remote parts of the country, a crucial mistake they realized too late. The reformists' neglect of the Brotherhood's base, Mahdi frankly admitted, set the stage for what he calls the Great Theft, that is, the old guard's success in stealing the younger generations from them. To fully appreciate the significance of these differences in the power balance among competing factions within Islamist groups, let's compare the paths taken by Ennahda in Tunisia and the Brotherhood in Egypt in the wake of the Arab Spring. In Tunisia's Constituent Assembly elections in 2011, Ennahda won a plurality with 38% of the vote, over 4 times the share of its closest competitor, and obtained 89 of the Assembly's 217 seats. Yet from the outset, the Ennahda Party's top leaders stressed their desire to govern in coalition with other parties and to pursue an agenda backed by a wider national consensus. In a sign of these commitments, Ennahda formed a coalition government with 2 secular parties. In December, the Constituent Assembly elected Monsef Marzouki, a prominent secular human rights activist, as interim president. In addition, the leadership of Ennahda sought to draft a new constitution with broad national support. In March 2012, for example, Rashid al-Ghannouchi stated that Article 1 of Tunisia's new constitution did not need to be amended to include a reference to Shari'a, or Islamic law, and that a reference to Islam as the state religion would suffice. As Ghannouchi explained, The Constitution should be built on what all people believe, not just what people in Ennahda believe. We also didn't want to divide Tunisians. El-Ghannouchi and other senior Ennahda leaders also declared their support for the 1956 Code of Personal Status that is vigorously defended by women's rights groups in Tunisia. Further, Ennahda promised to expand employment opportunities for women and was one of the first parties to support the zipper rule in elections, requiring the alternation of men and women on party lists. As a consequence of this rule, the Constituent Assembly included 59 women, 42 of whom were affiliated with the Islamist Ennahda party. Yet the progressive policy positions articulated by Ennahda's senior leadership did not reflect a consensus within the Ennahda party at large. Much of Ennahda's bloc in the Constituent Assembly, as well as many members of its base, were more religiously conservative in orientation. For example, while only 12 of 80 members in Ennahda's senior executive council voted to press for a reference to Shari'a in the new constitution, a straw poll of Ennahda deputies in the Constituent Assembly indicated that a majority of them supported exactly such a move. Further, in a sign of their disconnect from senior Ennahda leaders' stated commitment to free speech, Ennahda deputies issued a proposal in June 2012 calling for the criminalization of insults to Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, and the sacred values of Islam to be punished with prison terms and fines. Likewise, in August of that year, the Rights and Freedom Subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly, dominated by Ennahda deputies, proposed language in the Constitution defining women as complementary rather than equal to men. This language triggered a massive outcry from secular groups and was subsequently abandoned. So like the Brotherhood and other Arab Islamist groups, Ennahda is not a monolith, but an umbrella organization embracing a wide range of opinion. Where such Islamist groups differ is in the power balance among their rival factions. Hence, what sets the Tunisian case apart is the dominant position of progressive leaders like El-Ghannouchi at the apex of the Ennahda party. That being said, Ennahda's success in getting Tunisia's democratic transition off to a good start should not be exaggerated. A great deal of distrust persists between the Islamists and the secular opposition, and the road ahead is likely to present new flashpoints of conflict. Nevertheless, Ennahda's senior leaders have demonstrated that they are committed to and aware that the success of Tunisia's democratic transition hinges upon continued efforts at national reconciliation. Let us now turn to the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which, as I noted earlier, remained under the control of the old guard and their close allies at the time that the Mubarak regime collapsed. The dominant position of leaders wedded to more conservative interpretations of Islam, including a stress on the primacy of Shari'a as the basis of legislation, made consensus and coalition building across partisan lines more difficult in Egypt than in Tunisia. In addition, the prospects for conflict were heightened by broader features of the political environment. First was the presence of a Salafi current that was much larger and better organized politically than its counterpart in Tunisia, making it a force to be reckoned with that limited the Brotherhood's ability to forge common ground with its secular rivals. A second factor was the continued power of state officials carried over from the Mubarak era, who were deeply suspicious of the Brotherhood's intentions and unwilling to accommodate themselves to Morsi's authority. In addition, the sequencing of Egypt's transition, with parliamentary and presidential elections preceding the ratification of a new constitution, aggravated tensions by giving elected Islamists disproportionate influence over the shaping of the new political order. Such tensions were exacerbated further by the long history of mutual suspicion and distrust that has marred relations between the Brotherhood and secular groups, prompting leaders on both sides to prioritize the achievement of short-term partisan advantage over the hard work of consensus building and compromise. Such behavior fueled polarization, triggered open conflict, and ultimately put Egypt's entire democratic experiment at risk. Let me explain. In Egypt's 2011-2012 parliamentary elections, the Brotherhood won 38% of the vote, roughly equivalent to the share of the seats won by Ennahda in Tunisia in the 2011 Constituent Assembly elections. In Egypt, a coalition of Salafi parties came in second with 25% of the vote. Together, then, the FJP, the Brotherhood's political arm, and the Salafi parties gained roughly two-thirds of the seats in parliament. Yet on June 14th, just days before the presidential runoff commenced, the Supreme Constitutional Court dissolved the Islamist-led parliament, a ruling enforced by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in what was widely condemned as a soft coup. Shortly thereafter, Brotherhood candidate Mohamed Morsi was elected president by a narrow margin of 51.7%, defeating former Air Force Commander Ahmed Shafiq. Since Morsi's election, Egypt's transition has been marked by ongoing disruption and episodic crises of authority. Broadly speaking, elected institutions dominated by the Brotherhood have clashed repeatedly with senior military and judicial officials carried over from the Mubarak era, as well as with secular parties and civil society groups that felt shut out of the policy-making process, and with Salafis who favor a stricter application of Islamic law and view the Brotherhood as insufficiently committed to the Islamic cause. The tensions between the Brotherhood and its critics reached a new height in November 2012, when Morsi issued a decree placing his actions above judicial review. Morsi argued that such a move was necessary to prevent the country's judges from dissolving the Constituent Assembly before it had completed its work on a new constitution. The fact that the Assembly or the Commission was packed with Islamists, a bias that became even more pronounced after many of its secular members resigned, prompted allegations that Morsi had abused the powers of his office to ensure the formation of a draft constitution with an Islamist coloration, rather than one with broad-based public support. Amid widening protests, Morsi moved ahead with a snap referendum on the draft constitution in December, despite calls from the opposition urging a delay. The constitution was ratified by a majority of 64%, but with a reported turnout of only a third of eligible voters, meaning that only 1 in 5 voters actually endorsed it. And of special note here is the fact that the Constitution was rejected by 57% of voters in Cairo. In pushing for a quick vote on the draft Constitution, despite the intense controversy surrounding it, President Morsi and the Brotherhood reinforced the impression that they were using their control of the country's highest political office for partisan advantage, rather than to serve the interests of society as a whole. Why did the Brotherhood choose the course that it did? The Brotherhood's answer is a simple one. Morsi acted to protect the gains of the revolution from officials in the deep state who sought to reverse it. Yet, to my mind at least, this doesn't explain why Morsi and the Brotherhood were in such a rush. That is, why they chose to move ahead with the passage of a new constitution that was not supported by a broader national consensus. To understand why the Brotherhood acted as it did, some wider reflections are worth mentioning. The Brotherhood emerged from 60 years of authoritarian rule with its organization relatively intact, but its top leaders remained encapsulated within the movement's insular networks, convinced that they were uniquely qualified to manage society's affairs. Such characteristics left the group ill-prepared to govern a highly fractious society, particularly one with officials of the deep state having an effective veto over state policy and an economy on the verge of collapse. Indeed, if the Morsi government had an Achilles heel, or fatal weakness, fatal flaw. It was not ideological extremism, but hubris. That is, the Brotherhood sowed the seeds of its own demise through its reluctance to accept other social and political forces as equal partners and initiate the confidence-building measures needed to win their goodwill and trust. By June of 2013, many Egyptians had become fed up with the Morsi government. According to his critics, not only was Morsi quick to bully and intimidate his opponents, but had also failed to ease Egyptians' daily economic hardships. Millions signed petitions demanding that Morsi resign and poured into the streets on June 30th to deliver the same message in person. The military issued an ultimatum giving Morsi 48 hours to resolve the crisis or else. Rather than step down or form a new government, Morsi remained defiant. And on July 3rd, the military, under the command of Major General El-Sisi, ousted Morsi and placed him under state custody at an undisclosed location. By removing Morsi, as Sisi claimed, the army was simply responding to the people's will. Yet to the Brotherhood and its supporters, the removal of Egypt's first democratically elected president was nothing short of a resurrection of the very military dictatorship which the January 25th uprising had sought to dismantle. Since Morsi's ouster, the country's new political authorities have launched a systematic campaign against the Brotherhood. In August 2013, the military used lethal force to remove demonstrators from Brotherhood protest sites around the country, leaving over 1,000 civilians dead and thousands more wounded. Nearly all of the Brotherhood's first and second-tier leaders are now in prison, in hiding, or have fled into exile. Its media outlets have been shut down, its assets seized, its party headquarters shuttered, and all of its activities banned. Further, since December 2013, when the Brotherhood was officially designated a terrorist organization, membership in the group has been deemed a crime. Hence, Egypt's largest and most popular independent political movement finds itself vilified as a threat to the public order and seemingly abandoned by millions of erstwhile supporters, leaving those members still at large increasingly isolated and alone. The sequence of events leading up to Morsi's ouster and the resurrection of the forces of the deep state exceeds the scope of my book. But the book's discussion of the staying power of the Brotherhood's old guard and of the failure of the reformist trend to gain wider traction within movement circles helps explain how, in the BBC's apt phrase, the Brotherhood went from power to persecution in such a short time. Indeed, it is perhaps not a stretch to say that had figures associated with the reformist trend gained a dominant position in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, akin to their role in Ennahda in Tunisia and the PJD in Morocco, the Brotherhood would not have ended up on a collision course with other sectors of Egyptian society, and the military's disruption of the democratic process could have been averted. In concluding my remarks, let me offer a few observations that may help illuminate the path the Brotherhood is likely to take in the future. First, the Brotherhood will not be daunted by repression. Indeed, the ongoing security crackdown against the group has revived the mehna narrative that enjoys deep currency within movement circles. Mehna means ordeal, and this narrative pivots on the Brotherhood's self-conception as a righteous minority elected by God that welcomes adversity as a test of their faith. In addition, this narrative adopts a long time horizon, regarding the Brotherhood's current predicament as a temporary setback that it will overcome with God's support in the future. Indeed, in my interviews with prominent Brotherhood and FGP leaders in Istanbul this summer, I was struck by the fact that despite the tremendous losses they have suffered, they did not seem particularly chastened or prone to despair. Rather, the dominant tone of their remarks was one of optimism and resilience. An outsider might question whether Brotherhood leaders have fully come to grips psychologically with the enormity of their defeats and with the Sisyphean nature of their efforts to dislodge the Assisi regime, which portrays the Brotherhood as an existential threat and has deployed the combined power of the military, the judiciary, the state-run media, and the security establishment to prevent it from staging a comeback. Yet Brotherhood leaders' belief in their continued relevance demonstrates that objective events can be interpreted in different ways, and highlights the ways in which ideological conviction can sustain a group's resolve to continue the good fight, even when it might seem that all hope is lost. For now, the Brotherhood's networks in Egypt appear to have reverted into survival mode. With most of the group's first and second tier leaders in prison, responsibility for decision-making has been delegated to third and fourth tier leaders who lack a national profile but who are well known and respected in their home districts. Under these conditions, the movement's capacity for coordinated action at the national level has diminished. Nevertheless, the shift to a more decentralized mode of operations will help the Brotherhood survive the current state of siege. With so little space available for Brotherhood activity in Egypt itself, Brotherhood and FJP leaders who managed to flee the country for bases in Europe, Turkey, and the Gulf have emerged as important players. Such figures are working to keep the Brotherhood's message alive and are joining with secular Egyptian activists to mobilize international pressure against the Assisi regime and devise a plan to restore democracy once the current regime has run its course. This leads me to my second point, which is that the Brotherhood is not likely to respond to repression by giving up on democracy. The idea that the people have the right to choose their own leaders has become a central feature in the platforms of mainstream Islamist groups. Though they may have embraced this principle at first because it aligned with their organizational interests, it has gradually become ensconced as a new group norm. Further, since Morsi's ouster, the Brotherhood in Egypt has taken on the mantle of defending democracy as well as of representing Islam. As the clear winners in Egypt's first free parliamentary and presidential elections, the Brotherhood can claim a popular mandate to rule. Against this backdrop, the Assisi regime's assault on the Brotherhood is framed as an infringement on the people's will. In sum, the Brotherhood's leaders are unlikely to give up on democracy because it is on its foundations, as much as on those of religion, that their claim to rightful authority has come to rest. More broadly, one of the most striking features of the Egyptian political scene today is that mainstream Islamist actors who once openly rejected constitutional democracy as a political system have emerged as some of its most vigorous and outspoken defenders. There's no doubt that much of this support is self-interested, and that Islamist actors' support of democratic procedures does not necessarily extend to support of the civil and political liberties enjoyed by citizens in democracies of the West. Yet there is still something remarkable about the fact that people camped out near Rabia Adawiya Mosque and other Brotherhood protest sites in the weeks after the coup were calling not for Shari'a or Islamic law, but for Sha'ariya, a word derived from the same root, but with the meaning of constitutional legitimacy. This does not suggest that Egypt's Islamists have suddenly morphed into liberal Democrats, or are likely to do so anytime soon. But it lends credence to the wider argument of my book, namely that the type of political system to which members of the Islamist movement aspire is not a fixed endpoint, but a fluid conception susceptible to adaptation and revision over time. Finally, my research underscores the fact that members of the Brotherhood are capable of learning and of adapting their goals and strategies to new circumstances. How Brotherhood leaders explain Morsi's ouster, and in particular the extent to which they view it as a function of their own mistakes, will shape the path they take in the future. As I mentioned, this August I had a chance to interview some prominent Brotherhood and FJP figures in Istanbul about such matters. I can't offer a full account of these discussions here, but let me note that one of the main things they claim to have learned from recent events is that the transition to democracy is more than the holding of competitive elections and the allocation of spoils to the victors. Rather, it is a process that can only move forward and establish firm roots through consensus and compromise. It will take time, my respondents conceded, for this perspective to gain wider currency. Relations between the Brotherhood and its secular rivals remain tense, and recent events have aroused further bitterness and resentments on both sides. Further, the Assisi's regime's virulent anti-Brotherhood rhetoric continues to poison the political environment, and the Brotherhood's rhetoric against the regime and its supporters has become more strident and vindictive in turn. Under these conditions, the prospects for healing and reconciliation are dim. Yet some Brotherhood and secular activists based in exile have recently launched a set of joint initiatives to break the cycle of blame and recrimination that has set Egyptian supporters of democracy against each other and enabled the deep state to shut down the reform process altogether. Such initiatives are at an early stage and have yet to acquire much traction in Egypt itself. Yet over time, they could attract a broader circle of participants and hence alter the balance of power on the ground. Will this happen? It's too soon to say. But the potential inherent in such efforts should not be discounted, for as the events of the Arab Spring have shown us, the seeds sown by small networks of committed democracy activists can, under the right conditions, provide a springboard for broader social and political change. The last thing I'd like to do before opening the floor to discussion is to highlight the analytic payoff of what I call slow research. As someone who spent 10 years on my first book and 8 years on my second, I am arguably the poster child for this type of inquiry. Clearly, in university departments that measure a faculty member's productivity by counting up the new items on his or her CV each year, this approach is risky. But a combination of sustained fieldwork, analysis of primary source documents, and development of new arguments and ongoing conversation with the relevant theoretical literature in various subfields of one's discipline is likely, I would suggest, to yield more significant insights than a faster and more superficial treatment of the same questions. In particular, I would argue, the close examination of a single case or a limited number of cases over time enables us to establish tighter and better empirically supported relationships of cause and effect than is possible in other types of studies. Finally, the type of close-up, sustained, and self-conscious inquiry I'm referring to provides us with a better understanding of existing gaps in our knowledge, and hence of the issue areas meriting deeper investigation in the future. At a time that qualitative small n research is losing ground to game theoretic models and quantitative analysis, particularly in American political science, we would do well to remember two things. The first is that depth can be as theoretically fertile and hence worth aspiring to as breadth. The second is that despite the preference for parsimony in the behavioral social sciences, when we approach important real-world trends subject to rival interpretations, what might be needed is greater attention to nuance and complexity, not less. Thank you.